Hi friends, I'm Red Stegall. I'm an entertainer, author, and proud Texas rancher. I'm inviting my fellow cattle ranchers to join me in the Alamo statewide stampede, a simple way to help preserve our Texas heritage. When you sell your livestock, just let the auction house know you'd like some or all of the proceeds to go to the Remember the Alamo Foundation. If you don't have livestock, no problem. You can still take part by making a donation. These tax-deductible donations will go directly to the Alamo Plan, which is preserving the Alamo for generations to come. And together we'll ensure we always remember the Alamo.
Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. 189 years ago this week, Santa Anna's Mexican army is marching closer and closer to San Antonio, where bands of militiamen and citizen volunteers are days away from defending the Alamo. Today we reveal the origins of the Texian military establishment, how shifting attitudes towards service shape both the Texian and Mexican militaries, and how these attitudes impacted who won or lost the Battle of the Alamo and the Texas Revolution as a whole. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We're joined by Dr. Bruce Winders, the Alamo's former curator. Thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
The Texians and Mexicans were obviously on different sides, but they used the same military model. What was that model and how was it passed down?
Not to forget that Texas is Mexico at that time. For the Americans coming from the United States, they both have been trained by the British, by the Spanish, and by the French. And by the time of the Texas Revolution, it's the French through Napoleon that have become the sort of the model for a modern military. And so that's the common background that they have. They both have learned and have been involved in the Napoleonic Wars. And so the tactics, even the uniforms and just the general thinking, they try to think along Napoleonic lines.
And what does Napoleonic mean for people who are not so well versed in military terms?
Coming out of the 18th century, you have armies, especially if you're thinking of Spanish Army or Army of Great Britain. You know, these are armies that are essentially loyal, not necessarily to the country, but to the king. And so it's a different mindset. Coming out of the American experience, American Revolution, through the Enlightenment, the idea is that modern militaries, standing armies, you hear that. Standing armies are bad because they are the instrument of whoever's in charge. And that under a republic where the people elect their leaders, the idea is that it's the citizens of the republic that will provide the soldiers at the time that they're needed. Now, if you have to have a regular army, it's going to be small, going to be controllable, and essentially it's going to do the things that citizen soldiers don't want to do, which is guard coastlines, guard the frontier. But the idea is that when there's an emergency, it's the citizen soldiers that will turn out and guard the nation. And so the militia is officially established for the United States in 1792, and it sets the parameters who will be in the militia age-wise. Back at that time, the militia law, you had to have a musket, or you had to have a rifle, you had to have ammunition, you had to be ready to show up fully armed and equipped at your own expense to take part in whatever military emergency it was.
How did weapons and tactics change during this time of the Napoleonic Wars?
What had been injected in by Napoleon was that with the type of weapons, with the flintlocks, you would have a line of battle. A line of battle being a line along which the companies of the infantry would be standing shoulder to shoulder. And they do that because it makes their fire more effective. So instead of having 10 people fire, one person fire, you'd have 100 or several hundred people fire. So it's almost like turning the line of battle into a machine gun. But then once you fire, you have to reload. Part of the line will stay loaded, and part of the line will then fire. They take turns. But what Napoleon adds is rather than just static on a battlefield, you stand over there and we'll shoot at you, and we'll stand over here and you can shoot at us. It was about maneuver. It was how can you get around the enemy's flanks? How can you turn them so that you can get behind them? How can you gain an advantage by moving large blocks of troops? Almost like a board game. How do you get around their line with your line? What he injects is maneuverability, but also speed. So that you're not just kind of lumbering around firing at each other, but you're actually conducting maneuvers to outmaneuver the other side. Maneuvering on the field is going to put you in a better position where you can win.
Something that set the Mexican military apart, a strong influence from Spain, more of an aristocratic model.
The Mexican army, it's a hybrid. And it's a hybrid of what the old Spanish army had been, which is an aristocratic where you have officers, but the officers are going to be men of higher class. The enlisted are going to be from lower class, and there's really not going to be a pathway from going, I'm a regular soldier, to I can be an officer. It just doesn't exist. Going back to Mexican independence, the way that independence was achieved was for Colonel Iturbide, who later becomes the Emperor Iturbide, says, we're fighting the wrong enemy. We as Mexicans, whether we are criollos or we're mestizos or we're indios, whoever we are, that's our identity. We are Mexicans, and the Spanish are not. What he was able to do is turn everybody against the Spanish and create unity, which meant you were going to have former Spanish officers still in. You're going to have insurgent officers in, whether they were at one time supporting the Spanish or they were insurgents. So it's a conglomerate of former foes. It's supposed to be egalitarian, but that's more in theory than practice.
Where did the Mexican military's weapons come from?
The Spanish weapons were left over by the time of independence. We're talking about Napoleon. The British, after Waterloo, had warehouses full of what we call brown besses. We do this today. What do you do with them? Well, you sell them off to somebody else who needs them. And who needed them were revolutionaries like in South America and specifically in Mexico. Mexico becomes the beneficiary of the surplus of weapons coming out of Europe.
Meanwhile, the Texian military has a strong influence from the United States. Perhaps not surprising since so many Texian leaders were from the U.S.
Now, Mexico, as a republic, still had the idea of we are a republic and we're going to depend upon our citizens to be the army. So they have a regular army and they have a militia army or a states army. From the United States, that's the same system they're coming from, is you have the national or the regular army, and then through legislation you have the states armies. And so many of the Americans that are coming to Texas had been in the militia of their state. Many of them had been just, regular militiamen showing up as privates, but others had been active in the militia in the leadership. And that is one of the sort of the hidden things about the militia system, is the militia system was closely tied into politics, because without the internet, without television, all of these things, how do you get to meet people?
And that was the real benefit to serving in the militia, political prominence.
When you turned up for Militia Day, it was a big social event. Often competition between the militia from this one location and the militia from a nearby location.
You compare it to sports teams that we have modern day.
That, we're better than you, we're going to beat you. And, they would even have names. Their company would be called the such and such Blues or the such and such Grays, the such and such Rifles, just the whole category of names. Communities would take pride in their militia, but the militia, its real influence was the political, being a conduit for political careers. Militarily, it just wasn't very effective because by law, a militia could only be called out for 3 months. And when you take into consideration transportation, training, and all that, it wasn't uncommon to 3 months to pass, and then it's like, oh, it's time to go home.
And you've done nothing.
And you've done nothing but move closer to the front. Andrew Jackson had trouble with that in the War of 1812. But the idea that got around that was volunteers. The United States War Department, through Congress, had an auxiliary system of raising troops that sort of combined regulars and the militia. So the militia would be the backbone of organizing a group called volunteers. So the War Department would issue a call to a state, we need 3 regiments of infantry and 1 regiment of artillery. And they would then be called into the regular service, but yet they were still militiamen because their officers would be their own choosing. They would choose their own officers. And that became a big bone of contention between regulars and volunteers, is volunteers saying, we live in a republic, we're citizen soldiers, we get to choose who leads us.
So if Mexico had more of an aristocratic model, then the Texians had more of a common man model.
Yes. De Tocqueville, the Frenchman who comes to the United States, makes that observation. And he's not talking about the Mexican army, but he's talking about aristocratic armies. Since he's a Frenchman, he's well familiar with that. But talking about the difference of American military mindset and of the European. And the words he uses, European armies are aristocratic. What you see in the American model, it's democratic. In my research on the war with Mexico in 1846 to 1848, there was a volunteer captain from Kentucky that said, our men came to us being the officers, and wanted us to promise that we would step down if they ever asked us to. In today's modern army, there are people in charge, and then there are people not in charge. What they saw was, we elected you. Of course, you're going to be our military commander, but you are going to be our representatives. We elect you to represent us. And one of the features that you often see in the Texas Revolution is officers will go to Stephen F. Austin, or they'll go to Sam Houston, or they'll go to James Walker Fannin. But anyway, they're saying, we want to have a council of war. We want our input. Our men want us to represent what they think you should be doing. It's interesting. One of the most famous examples is, maybe also one of the most mythic examples, is Travis and Line. I'm giving you, as citizen soldiers, I'm giving you an opportunity to have a say in what's happening.
But in that case, isn't it leadership from the bottom up and not from the top down?
That's the whole thing about in a republic. Under a monarchy, everything flows from the top. What the American Revolution does is it changes that system. So power, and the people expect power to go from the bottom to go upward. It doesn't matter our status. We're free-born men. We're as good as you are. And so you don't be trying to lord over us. And so the idea of equality, it's really a small letter D democratic period. And that's why you also see so much dueling and things like that. I'm as good as you, and I'm going to prove it.
How were the militia companies organized during the Texas Revolution?
It's sort of a mystery. And I'm saying that because not a lot of attention has been paid to it. The idea is, war is breaking out and people are just turning out. But in Mexican law, military law, the settlements are divided into militia districts. And so each community has, based on its population, has so many militiamen that are supposed to turn out. And then those organized into companies, and then they're put into larger groups called battalions. And then, it's like building blocks. But there's another part of it, of the American experience, called the frontier defense theory, which is you have the paper militia, because you do have elections, you do have captains, and it's supposed to be sort of self-sustaining, where if you're a captain of militia and you've enrolled the men in your community, into your company, it's through you that they get their orders, when to turn out, what to bring. But there's a tradition on the frontier that I'll say, your barn is on fire, or your neighbors come and they help you. And they don't stay, they put the fire out, they deal with the emergency, and then they go back home.
And you're not called back until the next emergency.
And they're not called back into the next. If, say, the Carancuas have stolen your horses or kidnapped somebody, the people that are closest to that, your friends and neighbors, they're the ones that turn out. And like you said, you take care of that emergency, and then you go back home. And then if there's another emergency, you turn out. And that's more of what was happening in the beginning of the Texas Revolution, is the militia existed. There were organizations of people. But in the beginning, it's that Texas is on fire, and we have to turn out. And one of the problems that then creates for the siege of Behar, toward the end of it, you've got reports of people leaving. They're leaving because we didn't know it was going to take this long. And it appears like nothing's happening. So we're going to go home. We're going to take care of our business at home. And you know what? We came here and it was summer. And it's winter now. I'm going to go get my coat. I'll be back. But the idea was we'll come back when we're needed. And that's really what you start to see with Travis's letters. That letter goes throughout Texas, and the impetus then is time to turn out again.
We spoke earlier about volunteer branches. Would David Crockett and the men from Tennessee count as a volunteer branch, or were they less officially organized?
Crockett comes out of that. That's a really important period in American history and will be in Texas history, because when you take like the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Creek War, if you were a certain age, you know, that's the stories you would have heard your father tell. You would have been engaged in those battles yourself in that campaign. Jackson's victory at New Orleans. You know, when old veterans are sitting around talking, you know, that's the type of thing they're talking about. For Crockett, he's actually called out as a militiaman. He served several enlistments because I had my 90 days, I'm going home. And then you would re-enlist. But yeah, he represents that militia experience.
Now that we have a better understanding of how the Mexican military and the Texian military were organized, let's really get into the Texas Revolution. What was life like for a Mexican soldado?
Most people would not want to be a Mexican soldado. When Santa Anna comes to San Antonio, Battle of the Alamo, there is no medical corps. If you don't have your private doctor with you like Santa Anna, you know, if you get sick or you get wounded, who takes care of you? That leads to one of the under-talked about aspects of the Mexican army is the camp followers. Usually, you know, we think of camp followers and we go, oh, that's kind of titillating. We know what was going on with camp followers, but it was your family, because the Mexican army made no provisions for your family. U.S. Army didn't either at that time. And so you brought your family along with you, your wife, your companion, you know, whoever, your family. Whoever is in your circle, they travel with you. Now, they don't travel in the same column. They travel in a different column. But at night, they're the ones that will cook for you, will, you know, tend for any injuries. It's an important part of logistics of how do you take care of your men. And it was their families took care of them.
Were the Mexican soldados conscripted or enlisted? In other words, were they forced to serve or did they volunteer?
The Mexican army is, again, being part of that aristocratic, is that if you are a private, you probably have been conscripted. And the idea is you're going to have a peacetime level, but in an emergency, you go out and you round people up. Or, you know, if you commit a crime, you're not put in jail, but you're sentenced to serve in the army. So that didn't give on the enlisted level, it probably didn't create a love of service. It was kind of like, well, this is what I do. This is what my life is. And that is unlike coming out of the Americas or the United States, where, you know, we talk about our rights a lot. And, you know, you're taking my rights away from me. Citizen soldiers believed in military rights. It's my right to fight. It's my right to, in war, to be in the forefront, not stuck in behind. And again, that goes back to the military/militia experience being something that's going to help you if you decide to run for office. The idea back then is we are the Army. We are the defenders. You know, we do have these rights. And so that's why on the American side or on the Texan side, serving in the militia or serving in the military wasn't necessarily seen as odious like it might have been in Mexico. It was because we're doing our civic duty. We're doing our military duty.
So what was a day in the life like for a Texian soldier?
Probably, and I don't think enough thought is given to this, it's pretty boring. It's boring. What are you going to eat? You know, is there going to be anything to eat? You know, am I going to have to cook it again, or somebody else going to cook? And they cook horrible. You know, I'm starting to feel sick again. So you've just got the monotony and the mundane. You know, are you sick today or you're not sick today? Then the anticipation of, oh, we're going to have a battle. And then it's like, oh, no, that's not going to happen today. And then certainly by the end of the revolution, you've got the anxiety that, you know, we had been on the winning side, but now we're getting pushed out. We want to fight, and Sam Houston won't fight. And part of it is on an individual level and on a company level is people are afraid that they're not going to get the recognition that they think they deserve.
There was jealousy between these volunteer companies and silo situations.
Yes. Whatever company you were raised in, you tended to be loyal to that person who recruited you. It became Turner's company. It became, Fannin's company. It became kind of possessive as to, you're missing the idea of we're all fighting for the same cause. It's kind of like they got a bigger piece of the cow than we did.
So this explains, during the siege of the Alamo, the competition between the people who voted for Bowie to be in charge and the people who voted for Travis to be in charge.
That's one of the really misrepresented ideas. And in movies and things like that, it's a point that, everybody can understand that. Travis, he's the young upstart, and Bowie, he's the seasoned commander. But no, it goes back to the Texans are trying to raise two armies, a regular army and a volunteer army. And the regular army, if you have a choice, there's going to be a specific period of enlistment, and you don't get to elect your officers. So if you're going to be a volunteer, though, you get to elect your officers, and at some point, when the war is over, hey, I'm going home. It's interfering with raising an effective army. Travis and Bowie's, their little spat, comes more out of that than Travis being unpopular.
And this wasn't isolated. It happened again at Refugio and after San Jacinto.
There are a multitude of little incidents where officers clash. And in doing that, they're kind of working on their own best interest rather than what's good for the bigger cause.
We get a lot of questions from listeners asking about our book recommendations about the Alamo and the Texas Revolution. And if anyone wants to read more about this topic in particular, you wrote a whole book about it.
I did write a book called Sacrificed at the Alamo. It's not a campaign book where it's like, and then this happened, and then this happened. But it's an attempt to explain why things are happening. Because if you understand why things are happening, then you understand the things that did happen. It provides context for it.
Sometimes we see in pop culture, the movies and TV shows, this gets reduced to an underdog story, the scrappy Texans versus the aristocratic Mexican army, but it's really more complicated than that.
It's hard for people to understand sort of the continuity that we call them Texans, but up until the Republic of Texas is formed, they're still Mexicans. They share certain things. One of the things they share is Mexican militia laws. But part of it, what sets them apart, is they come from different cultures. Different ideas about equality, different ideas, because in Mexico, one of the ways that they're able to achieve independence is to promise there will be equality among all Mexicans. But that's never actually achieved. And in the United States, if you were a white male, you could claim to be equal to anybody. It gave Americans a sense of confidence, an idea that our system's better than your system.
In your research, how did you find that the different approaches by the Texians and Mexicans to military life impacted who won the Battle of the Alamo and then the larger Texas Revolution?
Since we're talking about books, the first book that I wrote was called Mr. Polk's Army, and it's the American military experience in the War with Mexico. And the War with Mexico is 1846 to 1848. The philosophical approach that I always took to this time period was we're not studying individual events, but how are all these things connected? All history is connected. And so, we're 10 years past Battle of the Alamo for the War with Mexico. But the study I did was a study of the American Army that's formed for Mexico. And so I had to do research on the attitudes the regulars had, the attitudes that regular citizens had against the regular armies. If you were an officer, it was because you're too lazy and you had political connections. You didn't really want to work for a living. And as a soldier, why in heaven's name would you become what they said, why would you become a hireling? Why would you cut yourself off from all opportunity unless you just couldn't do anything else? And so it really did color American society towards the military. But I had to start looking at volunteers. Who are the volunteers? Why do we have volunteers? And that had prepared me when I went backwards and started looking at the Texas Revolution was how can we get past the idea that these are just frontiersmen who just happened to turn out. And weren't they lucky that they had Sam Houston? And weren't they lucky that they had, Jim Bowie? Because they're natural fighters. But it's like, who are these people? And what's really interesting of late on the Gutierrez-McGee expedition, again, the idea of all history being connected, it really is. But you find Texans who are prominent in the Texas Revolution who are taking part in the Gutierrez-McGee expedition. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to start digging a little deeper and saying, well, who are these people? And the idea that only a few of them, like Davy Crockett, have some sort of right to call themselves, Colonel Crockett. You start looking at it and you're going, no, a lot of these people had militia experience in whatever state they came from. A lot of them served in the Creek War. A lot of them served in other things. So I think in my future research, that's maybe one of the things I'm starting to look at.
We look forward to hearing more of it. Dr. Bruce Winders, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
One last thing before we go. If you want to catch up on the Texas Revolution events leading up to the Battle of the Alamo, we encourage you to check out this week's bonus rewind episode. It's called Before the Siege, taking you back 189 years ago this month to February 1836, when letters that have survived the centuries reveal the repeated grave concerns that battle will soon break out in San Antonio. We've linked to this archive episode in the podcast notes. Also in the podcast notes, we've linked to more on Dr. Winders' book on this topic, Sacrificed at the Alamo, Tragedy and Triumph in the Texas Revolution. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.